All right, so we are live in both places, and welcome again, everyone, to our eighth week of beer judge training. We're now over halfway there, and today we're going to be moving from Germany, Bavaria, the Czech Republic, Austria, over into England and the UK. So the next few weeks we'll be focusing on beers from England, Ireland, and Scotland. So tonight we're going to be getting started with three categories: British beer, pale Commonwealth beer, and strong British beer. And I noted this on our Discord channel, but just so you're aware, tonight we're actually not going in order of the categories the way they're laid out in the BJCP guidelines. So we will be going, let me look at my numbers really quickly. We will be talking about categories 11, 12, and then 17. So you may recall we've done this once before, where instead of going in order, I kind of skip to a different section. And then of course we will come back and cover all of the ones in between. But for ease of making sure we're not, covering like 16 beer styles in an evening, or that we're not splitting them up in a super weird way, I have a couple of instances kind of reworked the way we're talking about them, but we'll get to all of them. And, when we do move through the categories like this, it's really not important to go in order because the categories are, for the most part, pretty independent of each other. And we can talk about any of them at any time. But I know sometimes you all might have your guidelines with you. And so it can be kind of confusing at first why I all of a sudden jumped into a completely different category. So we will get started on that shortly. We have 9 styles to cover tonight. I did just want to remind you that we do have the form set up now where you can submit your practice score sheets. I highly, highly recommend that you do so. And thank you for everyone who has done that so far. And we were able to get feedback out to you last week, which was hopefully helpful. I was really impressed with the quality of score sheets I saw. I'm actually in the middle of grading a set of BJCP tasting exams right now. And what I've seen so far from all of you is like probably the best ones I've seen, even going through and grading these exams. So please take advantage of that. If for whatever reason using a Google form or scanning your score sheet and uploading it isn't going to work for you, feel free to take a picture of your score sheet and email it to me as an attachment. That's totally fine. I can still get it to our reviewers to have them look it over. I don't want anybody to feel like they can't submit something because they don't have access to a scanner. Or again, if it's easier to take a screenshot for whatever reason, feel free to do that. Email it to me and we can get that taken care of for you. So with that, as always, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and I will try to take a break as we're moving through these 3 different categories tonight to answer any questions about the styles that we had just talked about. And then of course, at the end, we'll have time for more questions. So with that, I'm going to get this moved over in front of me so I can see it. And of course, this is like week 8. So maybe by like week 12 or 13, I'll figure out how to do this the correct way the first time, because every time I end up doing it some different weird way. And tonight is no exception to that. So, all right. British beer, pale Commonwealth beer, and strong British beer. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, we're going to start with the bitter family. And you'll see as we move through England and the UK that we have the British bitter family is, the one that kind of has started these other styles that we'll talk about next week. And actually, I think just next week, but in the UK, we have the English bitters, so ordinary, best, and strong. We'll see next week that those inspired a kind of spin-off in Scotland with the Scottish ales, so Scottish light, heavy, and export. And then actually Irish red ale is very much modeled on a bitter style. So this is, we'll start with talking about these tonight. They're all pretty similar, so we'll probably end up moving through these a little bit quicker than we normally do. because when we're thinking about something like ordinary, best, and strong bitter, it's really kind of a ladder, whereas we're going through the styles, which we'll see, we're moving up into different ABV ranges. Usually the color range, you're going to get a little bit darker, and your IBU range is going to get a little bit more bitter, but it's really just kind of bumping it up incrementally. So we're going to start with talking about the bitters. Then we will move into pale Commonwealth beer. So it's going to be British Golden Ale, Australian Sparkling Ale, and English IPA. And next, we're going to jump all the way over to the end of our English and UK section of beers, and we're going to talk about Old Ale, Wee Heavy, and English Barley Wine. And actually, British Strong Ale. I'm just realizing I may have to come back and fix the strong British beer category, because I'm realizing now on this sheet that I'm actually missing one. I hope I'm not missing it in the actual slides. If so, know that I will fix that before I upload them. As always, I've got our competition and our exam score sheets here. As you're filling out your practice score sheets, use either one, whichever one makes you feel the most comfortable. If you're planning to take the BJCP tasting exam, I would practice at least a couple of times using the exam score sheet. Everything is the same, of course, except for on that left-hand side with the descriptors, you don't have the actual flavors written out the same way you do on a competition score sheet. So when we're talking about the bitter family, these grew out of English pale ales as a draft product in the late 1800s. And English brewing historically is just a really fascinating subject. So they're kind of what I think we would call like early adopters of technology, particularly English brewers and English maltsters. And it's a really great way to see through English brewing and through the history of English beer, especially through the Industrial Revolution, how things like thermometers and hydrometers, how those were adopted and starting to be used, and really using something like an English pale ale and, that the bitter family growing out of English pale ale when there were other ingredients that they were allowed to use besides just malt, hops, water, and yeast. When, the pub experience became something that was very common and now iconic in Britain, which actually pub culture grew out of the plague. Because when the plague was over, people were wanting to get out of the house and go someplace and gather with other people. Does that sound familiar? Who knows what we'll be doing when we come out of the pandemic, what wonderful beer community culture things we can have grow out of this. So with British beer, that's traditionally going to be served very fresh, under no pressure at cellar temperatures. So when we're talking about cask ale or real ale, British bitters are really one of the main families of styles that we're talking about. And I won't go for BJCP purposes, if that's the path that you're on, it would be helpful to be familiar with cask conditioning and cask beer service, real ale service. It's not required. If you're going down the Cicerone path, then you will need to know a little bit more about it. The book Cellarmanship will tell you everything you've ever wanted to know about casks and real ale. But I will also try to dig through my books, my beer books, and see if I can recommend a couple of good ones. If you're interested in learning more about cask beer and about real ale, there's a ton of really great information out there, but just know that this traditionally served very fresh under no pressure at cellar temperatures. Generally, what we're talking about is being served real ale from a cask. Also, why when people say that British beer is warm and flat, that is not true. It is served cellar temperature, which typically is going to be a little bit warmer, particularly in the United States, where we have, most of the beer that is sold is usually served very, very cold, around 32 degrees, where something like a cellar temperature is going to be around high 40s, low 50s, maybe even as high as mid 50s, and no pressure, so it will be naturally carbonated. No pressure means that we're not adding something we're not using CO2 to push the beer out of the keg or the cask. Instead, we're just either using gravity or sometimes you might see a beer pump. I'm getting a little off topic here, but I think that I just really like talking about cask ale. So just know that's what we're talking about when you see something like this. Also know British beer is not warm and flat. It's just served in a different manner than we're used to. So most kegged or bottled UK versions, they're often going to be higher in alcohol and they're going to be more highly carbonated than cask versions because we're going to be using something like forced carbonation. So putting CO2 into the beer to make it more carbonated. This is especially true if it's being exported to some place like the United States, where we are, of course, used to very carbonated beers. And when we're talking about the beers tonight, obviously we're always using the 2015 BJCP guidelines, but they do make a point in the front matter of the British beer overview to say that these reflect the real ale versions and not the exported versions. So with the British beers, particularly with the bitters that we'll be talking about, it is a good idea. I'm sure all of you are already reading through the style guidelines for each one of these styles. But it is a good idea to read through because they do have some information in there about how to judge beers like this. And, it's normally judging the beer in front of you rather than maybe what you've bought before or had before. But definitely make sure to go through the bitters family and, give that kind of a closer look on how you should be judging these when you're sitting down to judge one. So we're going to start with ordinary bitter. And like I said, we'll see that each one of these is really just kind of a step up. So the ordinary bitter is going to be the lowest ABV of all of the bitters in the bitter family. This is a low gravity, low alcohol level, and low carbonation. Make it an easy drinking session beer. Drinkability is a critical component of the style, and this is going to be true for each one of the bitters we're going to talk about tonight. Drinkability, critical component. Something like an ordinary bitter, you can see the ABV 3.2 to 3.8, really pretty low alcohol, right? So it's very sessionable. And something like an ordinary bitter is designed to be, drank in a dimpled mug at a pub, and you're supposed to be able to drink it in quantity without getting hammered. So something like an ordinary bitter is kind of a community beer, right? You're supposed to be able to hang out and socialize for a long time again and still be able to walk home. Okay. So contrary to the name bitter, and this is another good reminder about several of the English beers, I've talked about this in past weeks when we're talking about beer styles, and there's no worldwide, there's no Interpol of beer police. So yes, something like an ordinary bitter is going to tend to be more bitter balanced, but it's not bitter the way that I think if you're in the United States, you think of bitter. I know personally, I shouldn't say I didn't grow up, but when I was of legal drinking age and, started drinking more and more craft beer, that was about 15 years ago when it was really this race for, American IPA, how bitter can it possibly be? So when we're talking about ordinary bitter, best bitter, or strong bitter, we are not talking about something that is as bitter as, again, if you're in the United States, as bitter is probably what our frame of reference is when it comes to bitterness in beer. So this is going to be 25 to 35. It will be bitter. It will be, noticeably bitter, but it's not going to be assertively bitter. And that's going to be true for all of the beers in the British beer category. And then when we're talking about SRM, and again, I think I say this every week, you don't need to worry about memorizing these stats. Just have a general idea of what the ABV should be, what the IBUs should be, what the color should be. So you will see with the SRM, the bitterness, and the ABV as we go through these three bitter substyles that they just incrementally go up. So when we're talking about ordinary bitter, with our aroma, the malt is going to be low to moderate. It's going to be bready, biscuity, or lightly toasty. That's going to be common. You can often, but not always, have light caramel. And remember, when when you're going through and learning these styles, it is important to pay attention to language like often, optional, always, never, sometimes, and keep those in mind as you're judging a beer. So let's say you have an ordinary bitter in front of you and you don't get any caramel. That's not a fault, right? If you get a little bit of caramel, that's not a fault. If you get a lot of caramel, then we're going to start to kind of border on what might be considered a fault in the beer. But pay attention to common, often, always, all of that. Hops are going to be none to moderate in terms of aroma. If they're there, we're going to have classic English hop character. So that's going to be floral, earthy, resiny, and or fruity. Our main hops for England are going to be East Kent Goldings. You may see them as Goldings rather than East Kent Goldings, and Fuggles. And those are going to give us that characteristic English hop aroma. So moving on from the spicy, herbal, floral, for the next few weeks, you're going to hear me saying floral, earthy, resiny, and or fruity quite a bit when we're talking about classic English hop flavors. So other aromatics, mild to moderate fruitiness. This is going to be another hallmark that we'll see in English beers. So English yeast strains are not very good, or actually, pardon me, are very good flocculators, which means that when you add the yeast into the beer and it's starting to ferment, is going to gather into flocks and fall out of suspension. So English yeast happens to be a high flocculator, which means that it's going to drop out of suspension very quickly. So what that's going to mean for a lot of our English beer styles is we're going to have mild to moderate fruitiness in the esters. And you can also, most English beer styles will have a low level of diacetyl being acceptable. Generally, it shouldn't be there, but if you get a little bit of diacetyl in an English beer, a little bit is going to be allowable. And again, that's kind of like a few weeks ago when we were talking about Pilsner Urquell. English yeast is a very heavy flocculator, so it's not staying in suspension long enough to, kind of clean up some of those esters and clean up that diacetyl. So for a lot of English beers, a little bit of esters, possibly a little bit of diacetyl are going to be fine. When we're talking about appearance, pale amber to light copper and good to brilliant clarity. That's another hallmark of many English beers, is they're going to have brilliant clarity. Our head retention, low to moderate, and our head color is going to be white to off-white. So when we get to the flavor, it's going to be very similar to our aroma. So it's going to be low to medium. We would typically expect bready, biscuity, lightly toasty. And I believe somebody asked us a couple of weeks ago, when we're talking about biscuity in this context, it's generally going to be more of the English biscuit, as in kind of that shortbread cookie flavor. That's, I guess I could also just email the BJCP guideline authors and ask them what they intend. That can sometimes be up for debate, but generally speaking, when we think of biscuity in terms of the BJCP guidelines, we're not talking about like a buttermilk biscuit. We're talking more about like the little digestive cookies that you can get in England. So you might also have low to moderate caramel or toffee. Again, that's optional. So if it's not there, it's not a fault. Bitterness is going to be medium to moderately high. Low to moderate earthy, resiny, fruity, and or floral hops are traditional English hop characters. Fermentation characteristics, moderately low to moderately high fruity esters, again, because the English yeast is a very good flocculator. Generally no diacetyl, although low levels are allowed. And it would be a little weird if this was a beer with bitter in the title and it wasn't, bitter wasn't kind of a focal point of it, but it's going to be decidedly bitter, but the bitterness should not overpower the malt, the flavor, the esters, or the hop flavors. So we talked about this a few weeks ago. If we've got something that is, here's balance and like, here's a little bit malt balance, here's a little bit hop balance, or I should say bitter balance, this is going to be slightly bitter balance, right? It's still going to be overall a fairly balanced beer, but it's going to tilt just a little bit towards the bitterness. Again, as long as it's not overpowering the other flavors, it's overall a fairly balanced beer. Mouthfeel is going to be light to medium light. Carbonation is going to be low because generally we're talking about draft products, which are generally going to be cask. Bottled examples can have moderate carbonation, but they're still not going to be highly carbonated. You're really going to kind of lose that ordinary bitter experience if you've got a highly carbonated bottled beer. So then next we have Best Bitter, a flavorful yet refreshing session beer. Drinkability is a critical component of the style. So we can see with Best Bitter, our ABV is going to be a little bit higher. Our IBUs can be a little bit higher. But one thing to notice with the IBUs, with Ordinary, Best, and Strong, they can all have the same IBU bitterness. They can all be the same color. The biggest difference is going to be that ABV. So this is going to be very similar to Ordinary Bitter. Low to moderate, bready, biscuity, lightly toasty is going to be the common flavors, often but not always, like caramel. Hops, none to moderate if they're there. Floral, earthy, resiny, and or fruity. Esters, mild to moderate, generally no diacetyl, although low levels are allowable. So you can see this is I think it's the exact same description as Ordinary Bitter. Color, pale amber to medium copper color, so it can be a little bit darker. Good to brilliant clarity, low to moderate white to off-white head. Flavor, again, low to medium, bready, biscuity, lightly toasty. Low to moderate caramel or toffee is optional. Medium to moderately high bitterness, low to moderate earthy, resiny, fruit, and or floral hop flavors. Moderately low to moderately high fruity esters, generally no diacetyl, although low levels are allowed. So with a Best Bitter, you can have, your ester character can be a little bit higher, but it doesn't have to be. Decidedly bitter, again, this is exactly like the Ordinary Bitter. Bitterness should not overpower the malt. The esters or the hop flavors is overall going to be very balanced, but just tilted a little bit to the bitter side. And then our finish is going to be dry with a low to medium maltiness. So we'll still have, again, that dry finish. You're still going to be able to taste the malt character in it. Medium light to medium body, low carbonation. Bottled versions can have a moderate carbonation, but it's still not going to be very highly carbed. So then our last one in the bitter family is going to be Strong Bitter. Average strength to moderately strong British bitter ale. Drinkability is a critical component of the style. This, out of all of the beer styles that we'll talk about, Strong Bitter really is one of the ones that is a rather broad style that allows for considerable interpretation. So if you get the opportunity to judge British beers, specifically beers in the bitter family, Strong Bitter is a really interesting one because there are so many ways that you can interpret, but still be within the guidelines. So you can see with this, our ABV range, this is going to be the highest ABV range, but really, 6.2, we're getting into like average American IPA territory. It's not going to be, very strong in alcohol. And this is also a similar ABV range to something like a Munich Helles, something like a Fest beer or Märzen that we talked about a few weeks ago. Again, beers that are designed to be drank in quantity, with a group as part of the event. So IBU range 30 to 50, we're bumping up the bitterness just a little bit. But even at 50 IBUs, we're starting to get more into the pronounced bitterness. And then the SRM, it can be a little bit darker, but at the same time, you can have an Ordinary, a Strong, and a Best Bitter, and they can all be like an 8 SRM, right? There's considerable overlap in those. So medium to medium high, bready, biscuity, nutty, or lightly toasty. Caramel can be low to moderate. So when we're getting into the Strong Bitter territory, this is when the caramel is going from being optional to it should be there. You may also have some different kind of Maillard sort of reaction flavors in there, such as nutty, maybe even a little bit lightly toasty. You should be able to taste, or you should be able to smell the hops. Those are going to be moderately low to moderately high. floral, earthy, resiny, and or fruity. Esters, medium low to medium high. And that's really a pretty big range. I mean, if you have something that's medium high, we're getting closer to the range of, think about, when you have like a Hefeweizen that has that banana flavor in it, that's going to be like medium high. So this can start to get very fruity. And then generally no diacetyl, low levels are allowed. They're not necessary. Again, if you're smelling the beer and wondering if the diacetyl that you're smelling is too much or is more than very low, it probably is. So with appearance, light amber to deep copper, good to brilliant clarity, low to moderate head retention, and your head color is going to be white to off-white. So that is the range of our bitter family. It's not a huge range, right? So we're going a difference of about like 3% ABV, which I guess kind of is a big range because the difference between like a 6% beer and a 9% beer is actually quite a bit. But again, like think of these as a ladder, with strong bitter being having the most opportunity for ABV, for color, for bitterness. And one other thing I will say about strong bitter, again, I know you all are reading your guidelines anyway, but within the strong bitter category, there's a fairly lengthy comment about the beer style or the beer known as ESB. So that's extra special bitter. Fuller's is an iconic brewery in England, and Fuller's ESB is a product they released, and it's kind of like Q-tip or Kodak or Xerox, and I forgot what that's called, but Fuller's ESB is a name that, particularly in American craft, has been turned into a style. So ESB, technically, yes, it can fit within strong bitter, but ESB and strong bitter aren't always one and the same. I'm not explaining that as clearly as I would like to, so I would encourage you to read through that comment. But the most important takeaway of that, and we'll talk about another style like similar to this in a few minutes, but if you're sitting down to judge strong bitters, don't think that they're going to necessarily taste like ESBs that you've had in the past. Hopefully that's not too terribly confusing. But so next, when we're talking about the flavor, we're going to have, again, bready, biscuity, nutty, lightly toasty. Optionally has moderately low to moderate caramel or toffee. Bitterness is going to be medium to medium high. So this was going to be the most bitter out of our bitter family. Your hop flavor is going to be moderate to moderately high, floral, earthy, resiny, or fruity, and medium low to high fruity esters. And again, generally no diacetyl. If there's low levels, that's fine. If you find yourself wondering if the flavor is very low, it's probably not. Hop bitterness and flavor should be noticeable, but should not totally dominate malt flavor. So again, if like ordinary and best bitters like this, strong bitters a little bit like this, right? So it's going to be, you will have the bitterness, but it's still going to be a balanced beer. And then we'd expect a medium dry to dry finish. So our mouthfeel is going to be medium light to medium full, low to moderate carbonation, although bottled versions, again, will have higher carbonation. Stronger versions may have a slight alcohol warmth, because thinking back, the top of our ABV range is 6.2%. If you're thinking about other like 6.2% beers, you're not generally going to expect to have a lot of alcohol warmth. But if you have something that's up at that upper limit, it may have slight. So again, language is important. It may have, it doesn't have to. If it's there, it should be slight. All right, so before we move on to Pale Commonwealth, I'm going to get a drink of water, and I see we've got some questions. Okay, so how do we determine if off flavor levels are allowable / acceptable? So like I've said a couple of times, if you're wondering whether it's too high, then it probably is. A lot of it's going to come from experience, but generally, as anyone who always, anyone who has judged even a couple of times, typically when a beer is flawed, you're going to know, even if you can't quite put your finger on what's wrong with it, you're going, like you're just like, I know something is wrong with this beer. So if you're wondering, it's probably too much. If you're doing something, let's say, I would say not necessarily in an exam setting, but if you're in a competition and you have this level of diacetyl, so let's say that low levels are acceptable, right? But you're thinking that this might not be a low level. One, that's why you have another judge to talk to about it, and you all can decide if the level is very low, low, too high. But you can also put that on the score sheet of, low levels of diacetyl are okay for this style. This seems a bit high. And, generally, if it seems like it's a little bit high, realistically, when you're scoring it, you're probably not, that's not going to take that beer from like a 45 to like a 25. Is generally going to be in there somewhere. So this is a very long-winded way of saying that if you're wondering, it's probably too much. If you'd like to hedge your bets when you're filling out a score sheet, you can say again, these levels of this are acceptable. This seems a little bit high. That's when you can talk to your fellow judge about it. So I think that hopefully answers it. But the more you judge, the more you taste beer, the more you start to understand what those allowable levels are. And I have last year doing a Cicerone training, I had gotten Pilsner Urquell as one of our like style discrimination. So it was tasting exam practice, and it was a diacetyl bomb. And I've had enough Pilsner Urquell to know what a little bit of diacetyl tastes like in it. And this was, everybody was saying, is this what you mean when you say it's allowable? And I was like, no, if every person in this room, including the people who don't normally do that well with diacetyl, can smell the diacetyl in this, it is too much. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so Sheena, when you said always, never, sometimes, can you elaborate on that? That resonated with me, and I would love if you could help me hit that home and to make sure the meaning is understood well. So being on the spectrum, things spelled out like that helps a lot. Neurons are firing. All right. So when this was something that I realized actually a few weeks ago, that my background is in law, and so I think that really helps me interpret the guidelines in a way that I find to be very clear, because that's a huge part of going through law school, is learning and interpreting. Does the law say never? Does it say shall? Does it say must? Never, always, shall, must. That's reading that as like, okay, so you shall do this. That means you should always do this. And when you're reading the guidelines, that's really what I'm talking about, is if it's there, does it have to be there, right? So let's say that you have a best bidder and you get roasted flavors, right? That's not supposed to be there, like a really dark roasted flavor. That's not a good example. So let me scratch that. Pretend I didn't say that. But paying attention to, is it optional? So if it's optional, it means that it doesn't have to be there. Is this a hallmark of the style? Should it always be there? Then it always should be there, and it not being there is a fault. So something like an Irish stout, you would expect that really high roasted dark malt character. If it wasn't there, then it wouldn't be an Irish stout. So that would be a fault. If it may have it, or it may have it in, low, medium, high levels, then it's, again, it goes back to, it can be there, but it doesn't have to be there. I feel again like I'm really muddling my answer to this, but hopefully that is somewhat helpful, Sheena. If not, let's follow up so I can be more clear. But that's generally what, when I'm interpreting beer styles, I pay attention to that kind of language. All right. Okay, good, good. I'm glad that that helps, Sheena. Okay, and then is it called Best Bidder because it is the best beer offer by the brewery? You know, my immediate reaction to that is no, I don't think so. And it was usually there is historical precedent for why it's ordinary, best, and strong. And I want to say that it's tied back to the gravity. So, the higher the gravity, not always, but generally the higher the gravity, the higher the ABV is going to be. That means it's going to be the more expensive. But let me check, Carlos. My immediate reaction is no, but so let me see what I can find, and I will get you a more concise answer on that this week sometime, because now I'm thinking, and my explanation does make it sound like that's exactly why it would be called that. But it also harkens back to the day when you had ordinary, best. Stout was typically used as a strength rather than a style. So you could have pale stout, dark stout, best stout. So yeah, let me look into that and I will get you a more coherent answer. But very good question. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump back into the pale Commonwealth beer. So this is one of those categories that is very catch-all, where I think they had styles that they knew needed to fit in somewhere, but as they were moving things around into different styles, like into and out of different styles from the 2008 to the 2015 guidelines, I feel like these were just kind of the leftover ones that they just had to put somewhere. So they created this pale Commonwealth beer category. So these are going to be pale, moderately strong, hop forward, bitter ales from countries within the former British Empire. And that is, this overview did remind me that when we're talking about for the next few weeks, any of the English, Irish, Scottish styles we're talking about, they are all going to be ales. So we won't be talking about lagers at all for the next few weeks. And that sort of thing is helpful, particularly if you're taking the certified Cicerone, where you have all of those kinds of style questions. It's really good to help you deduce where your answer is going to be coming from. So let's say you're taking any level of the Cicerone exam and you get asked a question about a lager, immediately cross off every single British, Irish, and Scottish beer style that you know of, because it's not going to be one of those. All the styles we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks are all ales. Ale brewing is very common. So there are lager versions of some beers available in places like in England and Ireland, but not really. Most of them are going to be ales. Again, and I think I mentioned this when we started talking about German lagers way back at the very beginning, but one of the reasons why lagers developed in Germany is because they were storing their beer in caves and in cellars underground where their temperatures were lower. And so that had the effect of self-selecting the yeast that would do the best in cooler temperatures. They would also store their beer for a very long time, which allowed it to be lagered. So lagering means to store. And that wasn't something that they did in England. So ale brewing in England, ales for the next few weeks. If we're talking about British, Scottish, or Irish beer, we're talking about an ale. So the first one we have is British Golden Ale, and the styles, with the exception of English IPA, British Golden Ale, Australian Sparkling Ale are really the answers to mass market lagers. So the macro lagers, that's still like 95% of all beer sold in the world today. And if you're someplace like England where they don't brew lagers, you need to have some kind of answer to that, right? To get customers, people who are expecting something that's going to be more lager-like. We'll see the same thing when we get to American Blonde Ale in a few weeks, and Belgian Blonde Ale. It was also kind of created for that same reason. So throughout these regions, we'll see these traditionally ale brewers coming up with answers to the macro lagers that are so popular. So with British Golden Ale, a hop forward, average strength to moderately strong pale ale. Drinkability and refreshing quality are critical components of the style. So we'll have, fairly low, I would say low starting to be kind of moderate level ABV. IBU range is going to be, again, not bitter if you're in the United States, not bitter the way we think of bitter, but decidedly bitter. And our SRM range is going to be straw to gold, hence the name British Golden Ale. So with our malt, we should be expecting none to very little. So this is another good example, Sheena, of no caramel, right? So if you're judging a British Golden Ale and you get caramel, the guidelines tell you straight up, caramel should not be there. It's inappropriate. Hops can be moderately low to moderately high, can use any variety of hops. And so the other thing that I've learned in looking through or learning about these beer styles is usually when you see any variety of hops, that means that it's going to be a relatively modern interpretation of some other kind of style, because it's not, this didn't develop because you could only grow these certain ingredients within the UK, right? It's, you can use any kind of hop. This was designed to compete again with those like mass produced lagers. So any variety of hop, you can have your traditional English hop. Citrusy American hops are now, or at least in 2015 when these guidelines came out, were starting to be more popular. So, this British Golden Ale could also be interpreted as an answer to something like American IPA, where they're wanting to appeal to that American, to the United States beer drinker. Frequently, single hop varietal will be showcased. So if we're using, maybe it would be all Citra or all Goldings, all Fuggles, little to no diacetyl. Again, we're talking about a British ale, so some level of diacetyl is going to be acceptable because that's just what happens when you brew with most British ale yeast strains. Straw to golden in color, good to brilliant clarity, low to moderate white head. With the malt, low to medium low, bready with optional light biscuit. So again, that biscuit flavor is very much a hallmark of British beers because it's a hallmark of British malt. Caramel flavors typically absent. So again, here that qualifying language is typically absent. If you get caramel in the flavor, it's not necessarily a fault, but I would say my interpretation is if I had a beer again where I was thinking this seemed like moderate caramel, then it's more than likely going to be a fault, or I would leave some kind of feedback about, hey, maybe retool your recipe to get rid of the caramel malt because it's a British Golden Ale. Something like caramel is likely going to be adding body and color and sweetness to the beer. Bitterness, medium to medium high, moderate to moderately high of any hop variety, although citrus flavors are becoming common. When we're talking about citrus flavors, generally we're talking about American hops, not always. Some hops like a Saaz hop will have a high level of linalool in it or citronellol, which is going to give you a little bit of that lemon citrus flavor. But generally speaking, when you see citrus, it's really going to put you like in the American hop frame of mind, because American hops are known for being very citrus forward. Not all of them, but for the most part, think of something like Citra, got its name because it smells a whole lot like citrus. Fermentation characteristics, little to no diacetyl, low to moderately low esters, medium dry to dry aftertaste. Body is going to be light to medium, low to moderate carbonation, although bottled versions will be higher. Stronger versions may have a slight alcohol warmth. Again, like we're getting up into like 5% beer, probably not, but potentially. So next we have Australian sparkling ale. And one of the reasons why doing these each week with you all is great, because I know that I've read through the guidelines. I've read through the guidelines probably multiple times. And I don't know that I ever paid attention to Australian sparkling ale because I was reading through some of this like it was the first time that I had ever read it. So our Australian sparkling ale, smooth and balanced, all components merged together with similar intensity, relies on yeast character. And that in the overall impression of the BJCP guidelines, I was like, I don't know that I've ever heard anything about Australian yeast. So I just went down a little bit of rabbit hole on that and learned a little bit more about Australian sparkling ale, not much more than what's in these slides. So this is going to be somewhat similar to like an American pale ale, right? Because we've got a similar ABV range. The bitterness is going to be a little bit lower than something like an American pale ale, but the color is also going to be very similar with it as well. And so an interesting thing that I learned about Australian sparkling ale is, so Cooper's, Australian brewery, they're the ones who have the commercial examples for sparkling ale. But when we're talking about yeast character, and I've got another note on this here as well in one of the following slides, but they actually a lot of times will serve it very similar to how you would traditionally serve a Hefeweizen. So with a Hefeweizen, you'll pour it out into the glass until it's almost full, or more correctly, until your bottle is almost empty, and then you rouse the yeast. So you take the remaining beer and you rouse it. You can either do that, or you can roll it along a counter. Is also common to mix up that little bit of remaining beer with the yeast that's still in the bottle. So just kind of making a yeast slurry with it, and then you pour that over the top of the foam, and it cascades down, and then you have this very yeasty Hefeweizen. Australian sparkling ale is traditionally served the same way, where they roll the bottle on the bar top to rouse the yeast, create that yeast slurry, and then pour that remaining yeast slurry beer mix into your beer. So that's in part why it relies on yeast character. So when we're talking about the actual flavor of it, low to moderate, malt is going to range from neutral grainy to moderately sweet to lightly bready, no caramel. So again, this is going to be really a fairly neutral malt profile. Low to moderate hops, the hop character is going to be earthy, herbaceous, or Pride of Ringwood. And the guidelines specifically call out the iron-like flavor of Pride of Ringwood. So again, this was one that I had to look up. And Pride of Ringwood is the classic American hop. So it's kind of similar to something like Fuggles or Goldings for England, or like Cascade or Centennial for the United States. So Pride of Ringwood has a very distinct iron flavor to it. So that's now when you read that, because again, that was another thing that I read and I was like, what are you talking about iron flavor? So esters are going to be low to moderate, frequently apples and pears, with an optional light banana flavor. So we're going to have that low to moderate yeast character. And as you can see, looking through each one of these, low to moderate, low to moderate, low to moderate is going to be very much a drinkable beer. Our color is going to be deep yellow to light amber. It's often going to be medium gold. Brilliant is decanted, but typically served with yeast. So that's what I was talking about. If you're pouring straight from the bottle and you're not pouring that yeast, you would expect your clarity to be brilliant. Persistent, white, tall, and frothy head with tiny bubbles. The flavor, low to medium, rounded, grainy to bready. Caramel is typically absent. Medium to medium high bitterness. Medium to medium high earthy, and possibly herbal, resinous, peppery, or iron-like. So again, that Pride of Ringwood hop, iron-like, but it should not be floral. Fermentation characteristics, medium low to medium high esters, often pears and apples. Banana is optional, but should never dominate. And, frequently when you've got an ester forward beer, especially when it's pears, you're going to have that banana character as well. And the banana is, as if you've ever baked anything with banana, that banana takes over very easily. So it should not dominate. You might get it as more of a complementary or secondary flavor to those apples and pear flavor. But again, if you're judging an Australian sparkling ale and you're getting banana, that's going to be a fault. High attenuation gives a dry finish with a lingering bitterness. And our other flavor characteristics, it might be lightly minerally or sulfury, especially if the yeast is present. But again, it doesn't have to be. Body is going to be medium to medium full. Carbonation, high to very high. Spritzy, crisp, carbonic bite, smooth, but gassy. So this is a very interesting, right? These, like the other palate sensations, we haven't seen something like this. But that carbonic bite is going to go, if your beer is going to have kind of that minerally flavor to it, it's probably also likely to have that carbonic bite. Usually those are kind of talking about similar characteristics. So then the last one we'll talk about in this category is English IPA. And entire books have been written about English IPA and the history of it. And we won't go into that here, but that's always really fascinating to read about it. But here we're going to keep it really high level and go through what the guidelines say. There's a little bit of history given for English IPA in the guidelines. So as you're reading through, pay attention to that. Again, you're not going to be asked history on something like your BJCP exam or even really on the Cicerone exam. But, just being a well-rounded beer enthusiast, it's great to know. And then also you can actually people when they try to tell you that IPAs were created to go to England, because that is actually not true. So overall impression, a hoppy, moderately strong, very well attenuated, pale British ale with a dry finish and a hoppy aroma and flavor. So English IPA is on paper, looks very, very similar to American IPA. It's going to have almost identical ABV range, almost identical IBU range, and it does have the identical SRM range. So we'll talk a little bit about why English IPA is going to be different from American IPA. So our malt is going to be moderately low, caramelic, or toasty is also optional. The hops are going to be moderately high to high, floral, spicy, peppery, or citrus orange. And an important thing when we're talking about English hops, that citrus orange character for English hops is more of an orange marmalade, whereas, citrus orange for American hops is going to be more like orange juice, navel orange, more of the orange pulp. So English IPAs is also typical to dry hop them. So you may have a slightly grassy dry hop aroma. Again, acceptable, but not required. If you get that's again, though, if there is a grassy dry hop aroma, it should be slight. It shouldn't be strong. If you find yourself wondering if it's too grassy, it probably is. So esters, low to moderate fruitiness, because again, we're talking about English ale yeast, may have a sulfury note, but not required. So this goes back to the original English IPAs created in Burton-on-Trent, which had very, very high sulfur water, very high in sulfur, very high in calcium, which made it perfectly suited for making something like an English IPA. But that in Burton-on-Trent, that very high sulfur water, that sulfury note that it gave to IPAs or any of the pale ales was known as the Burton Snatch, because when you would open the bottle, you would get that whiff of sulfur and then it would be gone. Also with something like sulfur compounds, as humans, we get acclimated to sulfur compounds really quickly. So that's another reason why you just get that snatch of sulfur and then, and then it would kind of be fine. So think about when you're drinking something like a Corona, and you first open it, you get that huge like skunky flavor. And then after a while, you don't really notice it anymore. It's because you've already acclimated to it. So when we're talking about English IPAs, sometimes brewers will Burtonize their water or try to create an English IPA that has that Burton water profile. If that's there, that's fine. Again, you'll have that little bit of sulfur note. If it's not there, it's also fine. You can have beautiful English IPAs without that sulfur note. It's not a hallmark of the style anymore. Color is going to be golden to deep amber, clear, although unfiltered dry hop versions may be a bit hazy. And when we're talking about hazy in this context, we're not talking about like the opaque kind of orange juice that like New England IPAs, hazy IPAs have kind of turned into. we're talking about just a very light haze. If you've been in a craft brewery in the past 15 years, you've had a beer with light dry hop haze. So it might be a bit hazy. I don't know that I would necessarily ding something like an English IPA for being too hazy, unless it was, I guess maybe that would fall into like the Supreme Court definition of pornography. Like I know it when I see it if it was too hazy. Our head retention is going to be persistent and our head color is going to be off-white. So when we're talking about an English IPA compared to something like an American IPA, that English IPA is going to have more of a supporting malt backbone, and the hops, the interplay between the hop flavor and the malt flavor is going to, they're going to be a little bit more harmonious. Harmonious isn't exactly the right word because it's not inharmonious to have, like your malt be just your background to lift up your hop flavor the way most American IPAs are. But English IPAs typically tend to be a little more balanced between the malt and the hop flavors, more so than a lot of American IPAs tend to be. So our malt flavor is going to be medium low to medium, somewhat bready. Again, that bready, that biscuit flavor, even that toast flavor is very common to English malts, traditional English malts, which is why we'll find them so often in beers. This is also why a lot of brewers, US brewers, like to use Maris Otter, which is a very famous English malt. Like to use Maris Otter in things like their IPAs, in their paler beers, because it's kilned just a little bit longer to have just a little bit more flavor development. That's where that bready, that biscuit-like flavor is typically coming from. Bitterness, hop bitterness is going to be moderate to assertive, medium to high floral, spicy, peppery, citrus, orange, and or slightly grassy hop flavor. Again, that slightly grassy flavor is going to come from the dry hop. And the citrus orange is going to be more of like an orange marmalade rather than, like navel orange pulp. Medium low to medium fermentation characteristics. So you might expect some esters because again, using English yeast, the balance is going to be towards the hop, but the malt should still be noticeable in support. So, we've got like ordinary bitter, best bitter, strong bitter, and English IPA is going to be slightly this way, but it's still going to be balanced. It will just be more hop balance. If high sulfate water is used, a distinctively minerally, dry finish, some sulfur flavor, and a lingering bitterness are usually present. If we're not using high sulfate water, medium dry to very dry with a lingering bitterness, but should not be harsh. Using something like high sulfate water, if somebody's wanting to make a very traditional English IPA, that's again something that you will learn to taste as you have more experience and as you're getting better at picking apart what you're tasting, what you're perceiving. So you may remember a few weeks ago, we also talked about German Helles export beer, where that minerality was really a hallmark of the style. And I shouldn't say hallmark because again, it's like this, it would be fine if it wasn't there. But when it is there, it really makes the overall impression very much, that much more so like what the guidelines say. So if you're using high sulfate water, eventually, as you get more experience, you will be able to tell when somebody has treated their water, which means you will also be able to tell when somebody has not done a very good job, but they did it anyway. So mouthfeel is going to be medium light to medium, carbonation, moderate to medium high. Again, stronger versions, we're starting to get in this style up to around 7.5%. So we are starting to get fairly high. You can have a low, smooth alcohol warming in stronger versions being the ones that are up around 7%. You really probably shouldn't be getting an alcohol warmth from something that's like 5%. So then our last category we have is strong British ale. And this, again, is kind of like the Pale Commonwealth, where these are stronger, non-roasty beers of the British Isles. They make sense within the category, but it also just kind of seems like they could make sense of all of the other guidelines if they've created kind of these catch-all guidelines or catch-all category. So I'm going to grab another quick drink of water, and I see that we do have another question. Would Australian sparkling ale be similar to German Pils? I think German Pils is going to be a little more on the bitter side. So that falls into the pale, bitter European lagers. So I feel like an Australian sparkling ale would be somewhat similar to maybe something like an American blonde, or I don't want to go as far as saying Trappist single, where where the yeast is really going to be the showcase, but kind of somewhere around there. I think the Australian sparkling ale kind of grew out of, again, sort of like the British golden ale, wanting to have your answer to the macro lagers. So Australian sparkling ale, maybe like a German Pilsner. Let me think about that one too. Carlos, you have all the questions that are stumping me tonight. That's good. I like needing to think about these things. So strong British ale. Excellent. I do have British strong ale, which, as you know, is in the strong British ale category. And I will just remember to go back and fix that on the first slide. I felt like I put it in here and then got paranoid that I may have forgotten it, but I just forgot it on that one slide. So British strong ale is, I'll have to go back and look at like what the 2008 guidelines are, because this is kind of a catch-all category, and British strong ale is a very catch-all style. And when you read through it, you'll see what I mean, because they say specifically, this is meant to inhabit the space between something like a dark mild and something like an English barley wine. Those are really different beers. So British strong ale is truly an ale that is British, that's stronger than the beers in the other categories. So definitely read through the British strong ale guidelines to kind of get a little bit better of a sense of what I'm talking about. You'll see it as we go through these, through the following slides as well, but it is kind of a weird style that's really not a style as much as it's defined by what it's not or by what other styles are. So an ale of respectable alcoholic strength, traditionally bottle conditioned and cellared, can have a wide range of interpretations, but most will have varying degrees of malty richness, late hops and bitterness, fruity esters, and alcohol warmth. So British strong ale, the ABV range 5.5 to 8, right? So it is fitting neatly in there, in between kind of the higher ABV other British beers we've talked about, and barley wine, wee heavy, that are getting, that are starting around like 7.5 to 8% ABV. And yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I ended up spending more time than I had initially thought I would on British strong ale this past week, just trying to figure out exactly what's going on here. So with our aroma, it's going to be malty sweet, often with a complex blend of dried fruit, caramel, nuts, toffee, and or other specialty malt aromas. So another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about British strong ale is, and I guess strong British ales in general, is that they specifically call out that these are non-roasty, because as we'll see in a couple of weeks, we're going to start going through all of the stout family, which within British beer, there's several variations. We'll actually start talking about them next week with Irish stout and Irish extra stout. And then we'll start going through like the tropical, the sweet, the oatmeal, all of the stout family. So British strong ale, non-roasty, because we have other categories within British beer where roasty beers fit a lot better. So keep that in mind. Other specialty malt aromas is typically going to be something like some kind of a caramel malt rather than a roasted malt. Hops are going to be typically earthy, resiny, fruity, and or floral, are traditional English hop aromas, and fruity esters. So you can see, even just going through the aroma, like how vague a lot of the British strong ale guideline is, which is also great news if you're a brewer and let's say you thought you were making a dark mild and maybe you got a little bit more efficiency than you expected or whatever, and you ended up with a higher ABV beer. Call it a British strong ale. Maybe you were wanting to make an English barley wine and your efficiency wasn't very good, or it didn't ferment out fully, so your ABV is a little bit lower. Call it a British strong ale. Is catch-all category. Color is going to be deep gold to reddish brown, generally clear, although darker versions may be almost opaque. Average head retention, low cream to light tan head color. Again, that's going to be because we're going to have some sort of specialty malt in there. And when we're using specialty malt, that's generally going to give us a different color foam. So with our flavor, medium to high, often rich with nutty, toffee, or caramel, sometimes light chocolate notes in darker versions. So again, often rich. It doesn't have to be rich. Your malt character should be medium to high. Typically, if you're around medium to high and we're not talking about some kind of roasted malt, you are going to have more of those richer flavors with like the nutty, the toffee, the caramel. Fermentation characteristics, moderate fruity esters are common, often with a dried, I don't know what that was supposed to be. I think dried or dark fruit character. So no to low diacetyl, generally not desirable. But again, we're talking about English ales. So particularly with English ales, since they are a lot of times malt forward, and particularly with something like a British strong ale or a barley wine, it is going to be more of a malt forward style where that very low level of diacetyl can actually add some character and complexity to it. Whereas if you had, diacetyl in something like a German Pilsner, it's going to really stand out and really detract from the flavor. Sometimes low levels of diacetyl can actually complement the overall flavor. Our balance is going to be often malty, but maybe well hopped. You will see on here, I did not forget to put anything about the hops. When you read through the guidelines and the flavor, you will see that it does not mention hops at all, except that it may be very well hopped and your finish and aftertaste may vary from medium dry to somewhat sweet. So this is one of the styles where they don't specifically call out the bitterness. If you're tasting your British strong ale and you're wondering if it's too bitter, chances are it probably is. The bitterness should be there to balance out that malt sweetness to keep it from being cloying. And alcoholic strength should be evident. This is kind of a weird one because if you have a 5.5% beer, you're probably not going to have a lot of alcoholic strength there that's not also indicative of something that's gone wrong with your fermentation. I'm getting a little editorial with the British strong ale, but they leave the guidelines way wide open with this style. So I'll just walk right in and start making assumptions and arguing with what they put. When we're talking about the mouthfeel, medium to full can be chewy. And if you've ever had a really rich beer, as a British strong ale is going to be, you know what that chewy is when you taste it. It's got a viscosity to it. So think about also something like a Belgian dark strong, also known as a quad, something like that, where it is like it just seems thicker. Carbonation is going to be low to moderate. And I love this note that alcohol warmth is evident and always welcome. So then the next one we're going to talk about is old ale. And old ale and strong ale have almost identical stats to them. The biggest difference is old ale is going to taste old, and we'll talk about that. So overall impression is an ale of moderate to fairly significant alcohol strength, bigger than standard beers, though not usually as strong or rich as barley wine. You will see, we'll talk about barley wine in just a moment. The ABV range for barley wine starts at around 8.0%. So there is some overlap. You can have an old ale that's 9%. You can have a barley wine that's 9%. It's not usually, but an old ale can go up to 9%. And that's actually the only difference, I believe, between old ale and strong ale on paper is that your old ale can go up a little bit higher in ABV, but generally, they overlap. And I don't typically go like dive into the commercial examples, but since we were talking about Fuller's ESB earlier, I will point out when you read the guidelines, they specifically talk about Theakston Old Peculiar. That's the last one that we have written down there as our commercial example. So that is an old ale. It is similar to Fuller's ESB in that it is an old ale. It's not exemplary of what all old ales are. It's got peculiar in its name. Theakston Old Peculiar is just kind of its own thing. So if you have had, let's say you're sitting down to judge old ales and you have only ever had Theakston Old Peculiar and you think, oh, I know what an old ale is supposed to taste like. That's Theakston Old Peculiar is its own thing. It fits within the old ale category, but it's not typical of what other old ales taste like. Again, a testament to the fact that beer styles evolve over time and are a consensus. So, at one time, Theakston Old Peculiar may have been considered all old ales should taste like this, but as time has gone on, the style has evolved away from it, and it's really there just kind of a stalwart of the style. So our malt aroma is going to be often a complex blend of dried fruit, Venice, caramel, molasses, nutty, toffee, light treacle, and or other specialty malts. Again, it's going to be rich, is going to have a lot of malt complexity. It shouldn't have any kind of highly roasted notes to it. Hops are usually not present due to the extended aging. So again, when we're talking about old ale, you will see there's a lot of overlap between British strong ale and old ale. The difference is going to be that old ale should taste old. So hops are usually not going to be present because of extended aging. Some alcohol or oxidative notes are acceptable, similar to a sherry or port. And old ale is one of those styles that I'm not outside of beer. I drink wine sometimes. I'm not really a liquor person. I'm not really a cocktail person. So I don't have a very good frame of reference for things like sherry and port. So I actually went a couple of years ago and bought sherry and port because I kept seeing them referenced in styles like old ale. And when I tasted the sherry and then the port, I tasted it and was like, this tastes like old ale, or this tastes like a barrel-aged beer, like a beer that's been barrel-aged for quite some time. And then realized like, no, old ale tastes like sherry. This barrel-aged beer tastes like this. The inverse of what I was thinking. So when we're talking about old ale, you should expect those aged characters. So if you think you're going to brew an old ale to enter into a competition, you can brew an old ale like this year to enter in next year. Like nobody's making a fresh old ale. And you will see when you're reading through the guidelines too, that they also reference that a little bit of Brettanomyces in an old ale is also fine. Again, it's okay if it's there. It doesn't have to be there. Appearance is going to be light amber to very dark reddish brown. Again, it's going to be an older version. So age and oxidation may darken the beer color. The clarity, it should be almost opaque, low to moderate cream to tan head. Our malt flavor is going to be medium to high, often with nutty, caramel, and or molasses notes. Light chocolate and roast is optional, but should never be prominent. So again, the beers in this category are non-roasty, which means you can have a little bit of roast, but it shouldn't be, you wouldn't write down roasty as one of your main descriptors. Bitterness, the impression of bitterness is often going to be dependent on how old the beer is. If the beer is very old and you've lost a lot of the hop character, the bitterness may be a little more prominent. Moderate to high fruity esters may be dried fruit or Venice in character, so it may be wine-like in character, again, talking about those kind of that aged flavor. No to low diacetyl. The balance may be malty sweet, but it may also be well hopped. The finish can be dry to somewhat sweet. So our flavor characteristics, and the flavor characteristics for old ale is really what to pay attention to when you're evaluating an old ale. Extended aging may contribute oxidative flavors, similar to a fine old sherry, port, or Madeira. Some wood-aged or blended versions may have an optional lactic or Brettanomyces character. So Brettanomyces is going to give us that kind of wild, the funky flavor. Wild doesn't mean sour. So if you're tasting an old ale that has some sort of acidity to it, is likely going to be lactic acid. If you're tasting vinegar, then that's going to be a fault. And you can, if you don't recall the kind of our different flavors from fermentation, including acidity, you can go back to week 2 when we talk about beer flavor descriptions, where beer flavors come from. And there's a couple of notes in there in terms of acetic acid, lactic acid, and Brettanomyces, what kind of flavors you would expect from each one of those. Our mouthfeel is going to be medium to full. Again, it's going to be chewy, low to moderate carbonation, depending on age and conditioning. Warmth often evident and always welcome. And then if it's wood aged, light acidity and tannins may be present. So with tannins, you may expect to have a little bit of astringency from those tannins if it's wood aged. If it's not wood aged, you probably shouldn't expect to have those in there. And I believe with old ale, they do give you the option, if let's say you're judging in a competition and it has been wood aged, that you should have that information in front of you as you're looking through the pull sheet and the description of the beer. So next we have Wee Heavy. Wee Heavy is one of my very favorite beers. Next week, we'll talk more about our other Scottish beers, but Wee Heavy is also known as Scotch Ale. So if you see, one or the other, they're the exact same beer style. They're used interchangeably. So overall impression, rich, malty, dextrinous, and usually caramel sweet. These beers can give an impression that is suggestive of a dessert. Wee Heavies are just such good beers. I really like them, but they are very caramel forward. And when we talk next week about the other Scottish ales, one of the hallmarks of Scottish beers is that they don't have a lot of bitterness. They don't have a lot of hop flavor because hops didn't grow well in Scotland, and they damn sure weren't going to, import as more hops than they needed from England. So Scottish ales are typically very low hop, very low bitterness. And Scotland was one of the countries that also had big use of things like heather, bog myrtle, more of a gruit type to add the bitterness. So that was also more of their kind of heritage. So adopting the hops also was like that. And then, hops not growing well, not wanting to get them to England, or kind of both combined to make it so that Scottish beers don't have a lot of hop bitterness or hop flavor to them. So our malt, deeply malty, very strongly caramel, no to low secondary smoky aroma. Peat smoke is inappropriate. I put this in caps. If you were able to catch my smoked beer seminar I did for HomebrewCon a couple of weeks ago, you understand how much I despise the use of peat smoked malt in beer. It is always inappropriate to use peat smoked malt in beer. And that is, I don't argue that point with anybody. The reason why sometimes homebrewers particularly, would add peat smoked malt to something like a Wee Heavy or other Scottish beers is because malt in Scotland was traditionally dried using peat, bog peat, and that would give it this very faint peat smoke aroma, because malt's going to get the flavor. If you're drying it over an open flame, if you're smoking it on purpose, malt is going to get the flavor in part based on what that fuel is that you're using. So if you're using something like peat, it's going to have peat smoke on the malt, which is why the low to secondary smoky aroma is no to low secondary smoky aroma. Some traditionally dried Scottish malts may still have a little bit of that peat smoke character to it. We should not be adding peat smoke to something like a Wee Heavy. I will stop going on about peat smoke. I really hate it in beers. It's always inappropriate in Wee Heavy and really in all beer. Hops, none to low. If they're there, they're going to be slightly earthy or floral. Low to moderate esters, no to low diacetyl. So our Scottish ale yeast and also our Irish ale yeast, as we'll talk about next week, are, Scottish, Irish, English, they're all very similar, right? They're all more or less from the same area, and the industry the brewing industry grew up in kind of the same way. So that you'll expect some sort of low to moderate ester. Alcohol in stronger versions. Our color is going to be light copper to dark brown, often with deep ruby highlights. It's going to be clear. Your head retention, since the ABV is going to be somewhat high, your head retention, it may not persist. You may be able to see legs. And so I believe when we talked about Doppelbock and Eisbock, we talked about the visible legs. So it's being able to see that alcohol on the inside of the glass after you swirled the beer, and your head color is going to be tan. So the malt flavor is going to be very similar, richly malty with significant caramel, hints of roast and nuts, optional. No peat smoke, we've talked about that. Hops, medium to, or low to medium low bitterness, low to medium low earthy or floral. Again, the bitterness is going to be there to help the malt sweetness, particularly for something like a wee heavy. It's going to be there to help kind of, tamper it down just a bit so it's not cloying. No to low diacetyl, and low to moderate plum, raisin, or dried fruit esters. So our finish may be sweet to medium dry, sometimes with a light roasty, grainy note. You may also be able to taste that alcohol. If you do, it should be low to moderate. We're not talking about fusel alcohol. We're not talking about an alcohol burn. Body is going to be medium to medium full, a thick, chewy viscosity, moderate carbonation, and our alcohol warmth is usually present and quite welcome. And so I knew that I forgot something, and this is what I forgot. I am missing the English barley wine. So we will go over that briefly next week. I will add it to the slides before I upload. I don't know exactly what I was thinking when I was doing these slides last week, but I did do them in like several different sessions. So we will talk about English barley wine. I did not mean to skip over it, but I did. So if you all have any other questions in this last few minutes, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And while we're doing that, a couple of, again, I would like to reiterate, please practice filling out your score sheets, and please also submit them so we can give you some feedback on them. What I've seen so far has been really fantastic. This is our safe space. We're here to help you get better as beer judges. So don't worry about, whether your score sheets are good or bad. Submit them, and, it's a data point to use to go forward. And if we don't have any other questions, and I will give you all 7 minutes back. That 7 minutes would have been taken talking about English barley wine. So we'll add that in next week. And thank you everyone again for joining me. And as always, feel free to reach out via email, janet@thegenfluence.beer, or through the website. Either way, they go to the same place. And I look forward